Okay, this is Generous Theology with Chuck and Brock, and I am here with my friend Chuck. We are in the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. We are in chapter 28, and that's about philosophy. And Chuck, you and I have spent a little bit of time in the previous discussion session going through the professor's essay, and we're still in his first section, which is about the historical background of philosophy. And he's done something that I think is very useful for the reader, which is he's given a nice progression in a survey form of real high points over the past 2,000 years. And that's well received from my part. We talked a little bit about the earlier part of history. Maybe we got into, of course, folks like Augustine, and then we got into Thomas Aquinas and the medieval periods. And I think we are right at the cusp now of talking about the transition to what most people will call modernity and what has been going on since then. And Chuck, I know that's a real interesting time period for you to be a student of. And the stakes are pretty high here because we're going to see a big swing from the age of faith, as it's sometimes called in the medieval time periods, to what's now called this age of reason. And that's going to really bring significant challenges to the Christian faith, and a significant challenge to the relationship between philosophy and theology. And so when you were getting into this part of the section and listening to the text about modernity, what was going through your mind for these main themes? And what did you think of the professor's essay outlining that task?
One of the most interesting things I think about reading this portion of the chapter is, how he aligns it with his thesis, which is this idea that there's a convergence and then a divergence and then a reconvergence and then a more prolonged separation between theology and philosophy. And so he starts here talking about Descartes and says Descartes usually identified as the thinker with whom the new modern philosophy eventually emerged from medieval scholasticism. And he talks about how there is the fact that Descartes was in some ways a Christian. He wasn't hostile to theology. He was beginning to really make a change, which was to make philosophical reasoning more foundational to human thought than theological doctrine. He talks about how in Descartes' Meditations, he uses philosophical argument rather than any appeal to the authority of Scripture. And so this is the beginning of that separation between theology and philosophy. And he points out that, there are others who come after Descartes are believers. He talks about Leibniz, for example, the rationalist philosopher, also being a believing Christian. But he points out that even those who were Christian tended to treat philosophy as an autonomous intellectual inquiry that was neither subservient to nor restricted by revealed theology. And so revealed theology, revelation, Scripture, becomes far less important to these philosophers. And as a result, there is a growing divide between theology and philosophy. And then, of course, the 18th century, we've got that division growing wider. He talks about David Hume, who, talks about miracles and how that they possibly can't fit within a rational way of thinking. And, he established a reputation as an author of philosophy hostile to theology and religion. So maybe you had Locke and Leibniz and Hobbes and Descartes, who some of their views we would look back on and say there was some hostility there, but that they weren't purposefully hostile necessarily. It's just that they deviated from putting Scripture first, which in some ways is a hostile act, but they didn't do so purposefully. Now you have Hume, who's now this is done purposefully. And so you have this story of this growing gap and this growing divide between philosophy and theology. And while he doesn't come right out and say it, I think it's pretty clear that, theology becomes separated not only from philosophy, but all sorts of scientific endeavor. There's an attempt to make the study of philosophy more empirical, more rational, and there's difference between those things. But a lot of the differences of opinions that you see in this era are about the difference between how do you know things, and they're still all entirely based on humans, right? It's either are they things that we can sense? Are they things that empirically we can determine? Or are they things that rationally we can think about and our human minds are the creator of the way of looking at things? But either way, it's separated from revealed theology or revelation or scripture. And then I find it really interesting that we come to Immanuel Kant. And of course, Kant, you and I have talked about Kant at length when we read through the 19th century philosophy book that we read through. And there is a sense that Kant personally was less hostile to Christianity than Hume was. And he actually talks about some theological topics as if they are things that are worthy of discussion, where Hume might have, thought otherwise. And he even talks about original sin, as Professor Graham points out, which in some ways is almost a surprise that one would talk about this idea of original sin once one has shed the importance of revelation and has turned only inward to the human self. But for Kant, even though he treats theology and he treats religion perhaps a little less hostile than Hume did, there's still a disconnect here. This is not a rapprochement of theology with philosophy. Rather, it is almost a way of saying, hey, look, even theology itself needs to be subject to these rational ways of thinking. And Professor Graham says, for Kant, demonstrable truths properly called theological are few, very general, and not notably Christian. His groundwork to the metaphysics of morals attempts to found morality not on God, but on the principles of pure practical reason. Most importantly, Kant's three great critiques, which comprise his mature and enduring thoughts on these fundamental questions of existence, makes no appeal to theology or to Scripture. Indeed, in the second of these, the critique of practical reason, while Kant does invoke the ideas of God and immortality, he does so as the solution to a more basic problem about morality and human action, rather than as fundamental concepts in their own right. And I think that is so key to what we see coming forward, right? So after Kant, you have the post-Kantian philosophers, some of whom reject some things of Kant, some of whom appreciate. I think even today, Kant is considered a seminal figure, even where there are disagreements with things that Kant has written. But what is key here is that what Kant has done, even as he's tried to be less hostile to religion, is he places religion in the same rationalist category as any other kind of science, following those same kind of rules that have been imposed, and basically takes away the idea that we have revelation, that there is a foundation to theological and philosophical thought that is other than human, that is other than mere thinking or empirical discovery. Obviously, Kant was more on the rational side than the empirical side. And so God and theology and religion becomes not so much a study in of itself, but more of a tool to help us explain reality, to explain philosophy. And in doing that, by making theology, making religion, making belief the tool rather than the basis, which, the things were flipped in the past. Philosophy was used by, whether it's by the medievals or by the late ancient philosophers, philosophy was a tool to help us understand God, to help us understand doctrine and religion, help us to understand revelation. Kant has completely turned this on its head, and religion now becomes merely a tool. And while Kant himself may have seen himself as a Christian, that way of thinking really minimizes theology. It minimizes Scripture, and it really cuts things off. I remember as a kid, and I never read the book. I just remember a book that was in my parents' bookshelf called Your God is Too Small. And I don't know what it's about, but it wouldn't shock me if part of the thesis of a book with that title has to do with the fact that we've compartmentalized religion. We've made it small. We've decided that it itself is not foundational, but is merely a tool, and that these other ideas are foundational. And if that's not what the book is about, then somebody ought to write one called Your God is Too Small about that.
Chuck, I loved that survey of the professor's survey. Thank you. That was perfect. I think one of the things that comes out of this reassessment, we could call it the reassessment of modernity. We could call it the phenomenological revolution. We could call it the turn to self. We could call it the moving of the Overton window. But I think each of these labels or conceptual lines is maybe trying at some large point to capture that the essence of what happened in modernity is that, in short, atheism went from being an unacceptable part of public discourse to, in the light of these philosophical inquiries and investigations, to being something that is now today considered by most people in the secularized West to be a quote unquote default position. So if people thought in the medieval times that faith was really where you needed to start, you couldn't even begin to start to talk about reality without including religion, the concepts and categories that faith give. It's now the case today that it's the opposite. So the Overton window has shifted. As a matter of fact, I would even say that one of the distinctions between modernity and post-modernity, which would perhaps largely be our own lifetimes, is this idea that pendulum shifting away from faith and towards a rational skepticism and perhaps a rational atheism as default position. I think the pendulum has swung even into post-modernity into an anti-Christian position. So philosophy does seem to have, in the minds of many in the West, surpassed where Christianity used to be. You hear people refer to faith in the academy as something quaint, something vestigial, something that we used to believe when we were not very grown up, when we were not very advanced. But this idea of progress has moved the ball. And it's interesting to see how this progression started, as you pointed out. Even in itself, there were Christian philosophers who were moving the ball in this direction. And Immanuel Kant is a great representative of that. But you also have other folks like Schleiermacher, you have Soren Kierkegaard, and you have others. So people who are Christians who are critical of theology or critical of the Christian church. And by the way, we'll keep noticing that this word critical and critic keeps coming up. What is a critic and what's happening there? And that's a huge part of this shift. And so the other thing is that there really is a radical reconception, as the professor says. And so you have statements from philosophers. For example, Kant says, no one before me has even done philosophy. Now, of course, he didn't mean by that that Socrates did not exist, or Plato or Aristotle. But what he meant was he meant to redefine the terms, the language, from that which was couched in the historically Christian, in the historically dogmatic aspects. And it was instead moved into this new reconception. And for lack of a better word, Chuck, I think we see how this is playing out in our own lives in the dictionary wars. Now, Chuck, when you and I were growing up, I think we read stories about how in Roman days, the masses, the Roman citizens, were entertained by gladiatorial games. And when you and I were growing up, now, Chuck, I'm not asking for a confession. I'm not asking for you to admit to anything here, but I will be one of the first to admit that I grew up loving this thing we call professional wrestling. And at one point in time in my youth, I thought about this and I said to myself, I wonder if this is what we used to do in the gladiatorial games, we now do as entertainment, in this squared circle, as the ring in professional wrestling is often called. And now, Chuck, that moving of the warfare from something that was very real, very visceral in antiquity, the gladiator games. Now today we're watching it on television and we're not actually engaging in the same kind of warfare. I wonder if that's happening to some degree with respect to the relationship between faith and a secular society, skeptical society. And where am I going with this? Well, Chuck, we're maybe not fighting war in the same way amongst ourselves that we used to. And yet we are fighting a war over the entries in dictionaries. And it turns out that there are staggeringly important implications for that. And Chuck, I just throw out this question that is on everybody's minds today. What is a woman? That's an example of a word in a dictionary being fought over. And if this radical reconception in postmodernity continues in somewhat similar fashion to how modernity, for lack of a better word, took the impetus from the Christian faith of the late Middle Ages, then I think you and I might live to see a world in which we speak using the language we have spoken our whole lives, and yet the culture that has come up around us will not understand us because it will be using those same words and speaking that same language, but in an entirely different way. And so this radical reconceptions of things seems really important to put out there and to note. Now, I skipped, in a sense, to the postmoderns, and that was not fair because we do have more to talk about in the 19th century. We have Hegel, we have Kierkegaard, and we have the existentialist movements. We have Marx, we have Karl Barth is mentioned and named. So Chuck, let me just throw it over to you to maybe mop some of that up in whatever way you feel comfortable, and also maybe to react to how I'm framing the pre-modern thesis in light of modernity.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I think we are in an important shift from the modern to the postmodern. And to some extent, I don't think exactly what that means has fully been determined. But I think you've put your finger on a couple of issues, one of which is that when we shift eras, language changes and understanding of terminology and terms changes. And as much as we may want to fight against even those changes, it is also going to be incumbent on believers, I think, to be able to communicate in ways that will be understood. And so we're going to need to, I think, engage in some of that discussion as a way of using language that will be understood. I also think that another thing that you've put your finger on that's really important is this idea of whether in the move from modernism to postmodernism, whether we are still going to tie ourselves so closely to a very human-centered way of thinking. And if that's the case, then the difference between modernism and postmodernism in some ways will be, for those of us who are arguing from an explicitly Christian point of view, we will still be on the outside looking in and having to argue from that outsider sense. Now, we'll say in saying that, I recognize that there has been a sense, at least in certain parts of Christianity, that there's still a feeling of being the insider, although I think that's led to all sorts of issues. And sometimes recognizing ourselves as outsiders is difficult but necessary and probably should have been done more even in the modern era. But we're going to have to continue to do that in the postmodern era. But I think we also have to think about, are there ways to challenge the two-sided but still entirely human-based, the turn to the interior, the turn to the self way of thinking about things. And if all postmodernism is going to be is a more feelings-based way of thinking rather than evidence-based, empirical-based, rather than rationally based, because postmodernism isn't necessarily really all about sort of rational ways of thinking. It isn't necessarily about empirical proof. But if in the end it is still entirely self-based, human, and does not recognize the human as a creature, as God as creator, as therefore God's revelation to us being something that is greater than us and something that we need to take seriously and take its primacy seriously, we're not going to be in any different circumstance. The philosophy may look very different than it did under Kant and under Hume and under Descartes and under Hegel and others, but it's still not going to be any different. Now, I do think that there is at least the potential, if done right, to have a seat at the table, but certainly the moderns are going to try to prevent that. And we can get into a little bit of that later too. But then, as you pointed out too, in this section, Professor Graham takes a few more steps after Kant, right? And one of those key figures in that story is Hegel. Hegel really became hugely influential in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. His he had an approach to religion and to philosophy and to art. And to some extent, Hegel had some ideas that could be seen as theological. He certainly approached theological concepts and ideas. And in doing that, what Graham says is that what he tried to do is think of theology and philosophy as allied or complementary forms of inquiry and understanding. Hegel was passionate in his defense of a rational and philosophically sophisticated version of Christian belief that stood in opposition both to the dogmatic evangelical Protestants of his day and to the hugely influential theology of Friedrich Schleiermacher, who rooted religion in feeling rather than reason. And in some ways, Schleiermacher is almost like the first of the postmoderns, right? And so Hegel is coming in with a modernist response, and a modernist response that recognizes that theology is a thing. It's not particularly an atheistic philosophy, although, if we're honest, most of Hegel's followers moved in an atheistic direction. But again, in Hegel putting together this idea that, hey, we can think of theology and philosophy as allied, as complementary, yet he's still, as much as he says that, he's still putting philosophy in its place. He's putting a rationalist, as it's put here, a rational and philosophically sophisticated version of Christian belief in first place, opposed to dogma, opposed to just feelings and that kind of thing as well. And in fact, Professor Graham himself points out that Hegel does this. Hegel tries to argue that, that this is a good way of thinking for Christians. And yet, even Hegel's more sympathetic contemporaries wondered if Hegel's philosophy was not ultimately atheistic. And I think that is carried out by the fact that so many of Hegel's followers were not only atheistic, but were intensely atheistic. And, we talk about Karl Marx and that Marxist theory being very much atheistic. But realistically, I think other offshoots of Hegelianism also are intensely atheistic because, as Professor Graham puts it, since it is philosophy that reveals the rational inner core of religion, there appears to be a sense in which Hegelian idealism renders theology redundant. God the Father is a picture or a metaphor to be replaced by the concept of the logical structure of the world. So even while he's using words that suggest that, theology, it's complementary to philosophy, we ought to work with them together. Really, again, what Hegel has done is turn theology merely into a tool, and merely into a tool for the primary engine of a rationalist philosophy, a rational idealist philosophy as opposed to an empirical one, but still a rationalist philosophy. Now, there is a sense that Hegelian idealism dies in the 20th century, and maybe that attempt maybe to have a little bit of a rapprochement between theology and philosophy by, in the 20th century, that just ends. Whether that is whether that's a reaction to some of the problems with Hegelianism, and there certainly are, I think we can certainly look at some of the worst ideas that have oppressed this world in the 20th century as being stepchildren of Hegelianism, whether it's, Marxist communism, whether it's fascist Nazism, and really even that Western individualistic colonialism, idea as well. These are all derived from a form of Hegelianism. They oppose each other on certain key issues, but they're really all descendants of this. And so I don't know, Professor Graham seems to think that it was just a rejection of Hegelianism. I'm not so much sure that it's just a rejection of Hegelianism as it is also the natural, what naturally comes next. When you have a synthetic way of thinking where you're trying to synthesize different ideas, what oftentimes happens is when one idea goes off the deep end a little bit, you try to rein it in, but you don't rein it in necessarily by cutting it off and saying, oh, boop, that's the end of that. It's over. And suddenly you move away from that because you've cut off that wing, but rather it's an attempt to synthesize various ideas again together. And the various ideas that are being synthesized are all ideas that are opposed to the primacy of revelation, that are opposed to the primacy of God as creator who creates his creatures, opposed to, the idea that there can be something outside of ourselves that is foundational, that is most important. And what Graham tells us then is that there, after this decline of Hegelian idealism, whatever the reason may be for it, is that there are two schools that come to dominate philosophy, but both of those schools are antithetical to religion. You've got the Anglo-American combination of empiricism and logical positivism, language analysis, which rendered theological languages meaningless. That's a very North American and English sort of sense. And then in Europe, you have the existentialism, folks like Kierkegaard and Sartre and Heidegger, and I think Schleiermacher to some extent fits with that, although maybe in a little bit different way. But again, that existentialism really is, to some extent, even though there are those in this category who saw themselves as Christian, again, took on the task of, as Graham puts it, providing a satisfactory explanation of the significance of human existence in a godless world. And so now, here we are. We're in the 20th century. We've really completely separated theology and philosophy. Now, there is a short little section here on Karl Barth. Professor Graham says that there has been this tradition of putting an emphasis on both the free grace of God's revelation and the corruption of human reason, which makes natural theology suspect. And since it was in natural theology, where often there was a meeting between theology and philosophy, we have abandoned that as well. And so, again, the role of theology, the role of belief, of faith, of Christianity is really abandoned. And even as Professor Graham puts it, even Karl Barth, who, again, saw himself as trying to bring some level of orthodoxy back into a Christianity that had been stripped of any power. Barth, wanted to, he thought that he was bringing the Christianity back to some form of orthodoxy. That's why he gets called neo-orthodox. And yet he also welcomes this separation from natural theology. He welcomes a separation between philosophy and theology. And to some extent, as a result of that, even his theology, and we've studied some of Barth, and I think there are things in Barth that are worthy of study. I think there are things in Barth that are worthy of really thinking about, and yet that separation merely continues. And even, in the study of philosophy, Barth's a theologian, he's not a philosopher. And it's almost as if that divide becomes even greater, and perhaps even out of the willingness of folks like Karl Barth. Now, I do think that we have some antidote to that, but the Reformed world, but Barth came out of the Reformed world himself, Swiss Reformed pastor and theologian. So, these are all things that I think we have to understand. As much as we may want to make Barth the other, there is a sense in which he is not either. And we need to recognize in ourselves where we speak the right words, as sometimes Barth did, as Kant did, as Hegel did, about wanting to have theology matter, wanting to have theology make a difference. Do we do so only in the service of what in the end is an atheistic philosophy? And I think that's something we've always got to look at. We've always got to be, that whole idea of the Reformation being always reforming. Some of that is about change, right? Some of that is about learning new things and learning from, the study of Scripture and the study of general revelation. But some of it also always has to be self-criticism, but a self-criticism that is based on the primacy of revelation, on the primacy of Scripture, on the idea that Christ is the Word made flesh. And it is only in the light of the works of Christ, the works of the Word made flesh, that we can really have a full understanding of the world and of its meaning. And we can't lose that. So I appreciate that Graham, even as he, I think, walks through this historical piece, is that there does seem to be something missing. Whether he actually picks up on exactly what's missing, we'll talk about that more in these next sections. But I appreciate that at least he has a sense that something is missing, even if quite identified.
Now, Chuck, that's a beautiful follow-up, and I want to thank you for it. I'm in complete agreement with you on the characterizations there, and I enjoyed the professor's essay discussing all of the back and forth to this. I think one of the things that I want to bring out is the professor speaks of what I'm going to call the weaponization of philosophy. And so you talked about in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you talked about the schools of Romanticism, also empiricism, logical positivism, as well as the Hegelian schools that had come before it. You mentioned Marxism. And we have this idea that whatever the decoupling of philosophy from theology, whatever else it was meant to do, it appears to me as a student of history that there was a very clear, I'm trying to think of the right word, there was a very clear movement away from the organic foundations of Western Christendom that characterized earlier periods. And in some sense, I'll throw this around and throw this out. Logical positivism might be one of the better examples. It is a school of philosophical thought that was never very highly regarded as providing an answer to the own issues that it raises. But it was much more about critiquing and criticizing the dogmatic Christian West. In other words, there was never any thought that in the secularizing academies, people didn't think in terms of, well, we have to, if we're going to replace Christianity, if we're going to decouple philosophy from theology and move forward with that and leave theology behind, we need to actually answer the question that everyone agrees theology at least was trying to address. If the critic says Christianity and theology was not answering these, that's one thing. But absolutely, there was a worldview involved, and there were maps of meaning about reality that Christians made and put forward in the public square of ideas. And so much of these philosophical schools that you mentioned seem to have this aspect of them that no one has an expectation that they themselves will carry water. But the expectation is that they are sharp enough to disembowel the Christian remnants that still have some sort of hold over the culture. You and I did an episode, this was, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago now, where we talked about the educational system and how the Geisteswissenschaften, whatever it is about, and it's about many things. But the one thing that it's always unified on is that it's not the Christian dogmatism that it seeks to replace. And so I think it's fair to talk about modernity and then postmodernity as the decline and then subsequent fall of the Christian West, as it was conceptually in this high place of esteem, in this high place of mindshare, and in this high place in the public marketplace of ideas. And I was thinking about an analogous situation, Chuck. Historians, when they talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, historians have found putting a line in the sand and saying, okay, here's the before, and then here's the after period. They've found that to be very difficult. And so what many historians in modernity have done is they have put a line in the sand in political terms in 476 AD, when Odoacer, the German mercenary, overthrew Romulus Augustulus. That is now, by most historians, quote unquote, the fall of the Roman Empire, at least in the West. Now, interestingly enough, Chuck, if you and I had a time machine and we went back to that time period and we were in Italy when Odoacer reigned, when he took power, and if we were there in the aftermath, there's some reason to think that the average Roman of the day would not have said the same thing. They would not have said, oh, wow, our Western Roman Empire has fallen. And there's some evidence that, in fact, the Romans who lived in Italy and who lived in other Western regions didn't see it as a fall. And yet something really had changed. And so I'm not too angry with the historians who want to put that dividing place there. Chuck, I'm going to try doing the same thing here. And there's a little bit of controversy and there's a little bit of, it's an arguable point. But let me say this. I'm just going to throw out and say the end of World War II is where, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, whoever our successors are, unless, of course, the Lord has come, but whoever our successors are going to point the finger and do something maybe roughly similar. They're going to say the Christian West fell and it happened around here. And you and I, in our lifetimes, we might be like the Romans who lived under the rule of Odoacer. Maybe we don't even see that this change has happened. And yet people looking at our situation from a distance are going to say something to the effect of, how could you have missed it? And so I think Professor Graham in the essay gives us enough reason to declare that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to ask you, Chuck, if you maybe agree, and if you don't, again, I think this is an arguable point. But here's where it all comes back. In some sense, this is tragic. In some sense, this is really concerning to those of us who value what the best of Western Christendom was. But there's another sense in which, just even though Odoacer was now ruling the Western Roman Empire, in some sense, the existential situation was the same. So there was not a quote-unquote Roman emperor in the same sense that Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, the Antonines, and then all of the Romans throughout the history of the empire were no longer, that lineage had been broken. That political lineage was gone. And yet, for the people living in that time, they still had all the same needs that a political society has to answer. What form of government are we going to live in? How are we going to get things done? How are we going to conduct business and raise families and do things? And so in that sense, in the second section, which is entitled Metaphysics, this is, I think, the Christian's answer to that process. So I would say we, Western Christendom, have been dethroned. But even after that, you and I wake up in the morning, Chuck, as well as our secular friends, and we have the same metaphysical existential issue. And so maybe we're not on the throne. Maybe we're not calling the shots. Maybe I'm not saying, okay, Chuck, you and I have all of the political power, and so we're going to suppress everybody who's not a Christian. But maybe that's to some degree a change in task, a change in role for us. But the same questions need to be answered. And to my thinking, as long as there is a need, as long as there is a marketplace of ideas, as long as there still are the remnants of God's wholesome goodness in the sinful human creation that point back to him, you and I can still go out into the town square and we can cry. We can still go out into the town square and offer our wares. We can still busk about the goodness of God. We can sing. Now, Chuck, we can't force everyone in the town to see it our way. And yet, maybe that's, in the end, not our task at all. And so even though, of course, I am quite concerned over how this chapter has unfolded, but I think all of the questions still need to be answered, and you and I have a place in this new town square. Let me throw it over to you from there for some final thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, as you say, the idea of that the fall has occurred, maybe occurred at the end of World War II, certainly is arguable. I sometimes wonder whether we're living in the Byzantine Empire. The fall of Rome, 476, is the date that we've given to it, but we know that there's, like you've put it, and not everybody would have seen it that way, and there are other dates that we could give to the fall of Rome. The fall of Constantinople didn't happen until 1453. One of my forensic students is doing an interesting paper, presenting a paper as part of his speech on the fall of Constantinople. But to some extent, that's also a key moment in history. It's also a moment in history that was possibly inevitable by the time 1453 came along. There's certainly a sense in which, while the Roman Empire continued its existence through the Byzantine Empire until 1453, it became very moribund, and there was very little coming from it in the last centuries of that. But there was still some Christian scholarship going on, at least in the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire. We're not always as knowledgeable about it being from the Western Christian tradition. But the fall of Constantinople clearly had a huge impact and really was the end of that ancient world, right? And I wonder whether the Anglo-American world in some ways is the Byzantium of, the fall of Rome occurred much earlier, and it occurred at the University at Jena, centuries ago. And it's only in the Anglo-American sphere that there's been this little remnant left. I don't know. I mean, I'm not married to that thesis by any means. There's some ways to argue against that as well. All that is to say, though, that I think there's two things that I would want to think about in thinking about that sort of idea that the fall has come, or is about it, has enough of it has come that it's inevitable, as it was with Constantinople. One is that even after the fall of Rome, even after the fall of Constantinople, God was faithful. Even after, you look at what happened to Christianity in the Middle East, and it's been decimated, but really until 15, 20 years ago, there were still some strong Christian communities in places like Iran and Iraq And really, the real destruction of those has only occurred since the Gulf War. So God was faithful. It may be that those communities were somewhat isolated. It may be that some of those communities were very hard pressed, and they were certainly minority communities. They were often, at times certainly experienced some repression, but God was faithful, and God will be faithful to us as well. And even if that Christendom, and I don't always use the term Christendom positively. Here I am to mean time and place when Christianity and Christian views were respected and, were within the mix of discussion. Even if that goes away, God will be faithful to us as we stick with it. Just as he was to those communities of Christians in Iraq and Iran and, other places throughout the Middle East, and still is today. There are still some of those. Interestingly, the largest Christian community now left in the Middle East is in those two countries, in Iraq and Iran. The other side of this that I would want to focus on as well is, being outsider, being out on the margin might not be the worst place for Christians to be. Maybe being in the halls of power, maybe now I'm speaking more negative of Christendom. Maybe this idea of Christendom almost as an empire was part of the problem. Certainly, Christ didn't come for political power. Even when he used symbols that reflected political power, like his riding in on a donkey on Palm Sunday, even then he subverted those symbols in a way that showed that being a Christian is really about being out on the margin. It's about doing things very differently than what the rest of the world does. That there is a separation between the powers and principalities that be and what it means to be a Christian. And I think we've seen that both in history, but also in contemporaneous times as well. So in history, look at what happened when Christians were being suppressed in the Roman Empire. The church was out there on the margins, reaching out to the poorest people, the most marginalized. The growth of the church really came especially among women and among slaves. And actually, a large portion of it came among the babies who were left out to be exposed and die. And these Christian women would rescue them, and male or female, many of them female, more of them. But through that kind of very marginalized population, look at what happened. Christianity grew, and the centers of power had to deal with it. I think another example of that more contemporaneously is in China. The church in China has grown by leaps and bounds. And in a sense, the government in Beijing is clearly very fearful of the growth of the church. It wants to try to manage it, and it tries to do so. And so you do have this difference between sort of the official and the unofficial church in China. I'm not going to, make simple divisions between whether one is faithful and one is not, because I think there are faithful and unfaithful on both sides of that as well. But regardless, in a place of repression, the church has flourished in China. And it has flourished in a way that really is independent of the Western Christianity of today. And I have a feeling that those people who look 100, 500 years from now, those Christians who look back at the history of the West, who knows? They might all be Chinese Christians. The people who are leading the theological flourishing of the church might be in places completely outside the West. Maybe they'll be in Africa. Maybe they'll be elsewhere in Latin America or in Asia. I don't know. But it wouldn't shock me if China is at some point at the forefront of that. And why will that be? It won't be because of power, because certainly Christians in China have no power. Many Christians have less than zero power. They fear for their lives. And yet, the church is growing. And all that is, again, to say, yeah, God is faithful. And God is faithful. And when we're concerned that there are only, we may feel like we're the only one left, like Elijah did, right? And maybe we need God to point out to us that there are still 500 faithful in the land. Some of those faithful in the land may be in places we never even knew about. And it may mean a big change in the church, but that may be. And, we still have a role here. We're not in those Chinese churches. And so we have a role here in the West where we are. And perhaps that role is going to continue to grow in importance as well, as we're being a countercultural balance to a culture that is entirely unchristian. But that's something that we've got to pay attention to. And I hope I hope 50 years from now, there's people like you and I, maybe our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who are having these same discussions and maybe only 50 years on and thinking about what does it mean to to be a Reformed Christian witness in a postmodern world in a way that we don't fully yet understand how that world will be. So I don't know. I just wanted to give that reminder, partly because I needed it this week because of other things going on. But that reminder that God is faithful, even when our faith falters, even when we're not so certain, God is, and He will continue to take care of us, and He knows the future, and His church will not fall.